Okay, I think I found it. Okay. Whew. Give me another few moments. Okay. I think I got it. All right. This is quite a character test. Kind of being your own tech person. All right. Ooh, I don't know what happened there. Okay. I will be sure to leave the chapters on the below this video, so it's easy for you to navigate later on. Okay, let me just double check. I think we're okay. Oh goodness. Okay. So, welcome. I don't think I really ever got to properly set foot in the live broadcast. So here it is again. Start from scratch. Yes, we will start from scratch. Okay, finally. All right. My name is Kim, and I am super excited to have you here in one of my very first webinars that I'm tracking through on my own. So I really appreciate your patience with all of this. But I do hope you find this webinar mini session informative. So we'll probably go over these topics in an hour or so. Feel free to stick around or leave a little early if you need to. There will be a replay link. There will be a chance for you to just skip through the content. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for all your patience, for those who reached out to me. I bless your souls. I really appreciate it. Okay, so how about let's get right to it. I don't know if we okay, I think this is really good. Okay. Perfect. So today it's going to be a little bit intimate because I did have a lot of interest in this particular topic, but not everyone's going to be able to join in. I did have some questions from them that I will answer towards the end, and maybe you'll find these answers helpful as well. But if you didn't make it to today's live session, you are more than welcome to send me a message via email or through the contact form on my website. I am happy to provide you some support in whatever way I can. Okay, so let's finally get to it. I do want to share with you my screen, and hopefully this lecture will be easy to follow. Okay, so today I want to talk about the menstrual cycle, because this has really taken a lot of interest and time in my life in a personal and a professional setting, and it's certainly one of the most fascinating things that you could really ever learn, because there's so much to learn. We don't really think about it a lot until we have our periods, and so there's a lot of room for growth and appreciation when it comes to really understanding your cycles. So as I said here, it's never too late to need a refresher of your high school health classes, because it's very common to hear people really feel the gap with what they learned back in high school, back in their primary years. So I'm really hoping this reinforces some of the things not just from your formative training, but also for as you go through your own reproductive experiences. So Welcome to today's information session. I really appreciate you being here, taking the time out of your day to just, learn from this little lecture that I just put together. And again, like if there's questions towards the end, please just throw it in the chat or let me know through by messaging me directly. I'm happy to assist. So there is a lot of interest with the menstrual cycle. As I said, it is something that happens so naturally, and it's timeless. It's something that we as human beings, as civilizations, it's been acknowledged for for millennia, right? So, but it's been so it's misunderstood. It's something that has really caused a lot of anguish and oppression for the most part, especially for those people who go through periods. So, kind of on a more relatable note, I do wonder what comes to your mind when you think about your experience of periods. I would love for you to hold on to this thought, this word, this, maybe burning feeling that you have, that you associate with your periods. And you can write it down. You can just make a mental note. But I do want you to think about it, especially towards the end. And let's see how that shifts, how that word shifts over this next little bit we'll have to get together. I do want to make a quick reintroduction. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Kim. My name is Kim Abog. I am a naturopathic doctor by profession and trade. I practice primarily in Ontario and see a lot of people all over the GTA, Greater Toronto area, that is, in Canada. I have also expanded my skill set over my wee little time in practice as a full spectrum doula, which makes me, it's really a nice way to say I am an integrative reproductive healthcare provider. So what that means is I have the privilege of supporting people throughout their reproductive experiences. So this is my jam. I help people navigate their reproductive health challenges, and ultimately my goal is to make people feel more at peace and at ease with their experience of their reproductive changes, right? Such an amazing part of your life, and quite it gets a lot of bad rap, so I want to help shift that. And today I'm really excited to help you achieve and actually look forward to your periods. And I hope you learn a lot from today. I do want to I also want to acknowledge the land that I am in, at the very least. My practice is primarily based in Toronto, Ontario, Toronto, the Treaty Lands, and the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is also the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and it continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island today. Now, another point to make is that for us here participating, we would like to call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments to acknowledge that the current state of Aboriginal health in Canada is a direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools. We also call to action the recognition and implementation of healthcare rights of Aboriginal people as identified in international law, constitutional law, and under the treaties. And we also call to action the establishment of measurable goals to identify and close the gaps in health outcomes between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal communities. So these efforts would help to focus on indicators such as infant mortality, maternal health, suicide, mental health, addictions, life expectancy, birth rates, infant and child health issues, chronic diseases, illness and injury incidents, and the availability of appropriate resources. So I do want to make light of that, because it is something that we as health practitioners and people who practice health should be aware of. So for today, I said we'll be spending the next hour-ish just to kind of cover what, how to really appreciate your cycles. And there's layers to this, the agenda is really to first understand why our cycles exist, get a closer look on how these processes carry out. We also want to have a better understanding of what obstacles or mistakes we are making when it comes to promoting good health, good menstrual health, and all that, and some strategies that you can utilize to be able to achieve these benefits to actually appreciating your menstrual cycles. And interestingly enough, this agenda we have today are also the same phases that we go through in order to be more cognizant and more appreciative of our reproductive cycle. So I want to explore each portion of this in more depth, and I hope you follow me through this. So first and foremost, it's very important to understand why we have periods in the first place. So this piece is important because when we get lost, when we hyperfixate on the menstrual symptoms that we suffer from, and we try to fix it, right? Like, there's obviously a lot of tools and interventions that we can, potentially benefit from, but it's not the most sustainable way, right? Like, when we just try to remedy it, have a band-aid over it, it doesn't really get to the root cause of the issues. So when you have a broader perspective on why your cycles happen in the first place and how we can promote these processes in place, then you have a more intentional means of taking care of your body, taking care of your periods, and ultimately taking care of yourself. So that's where we start. We start with the why. And the big why is really that reproduction is the motivation. That's why it's called the reproductive cycle, right? So, when we think about periods, we think about menstrual cycles, often we use them interchangeably. But in fact, your period is, your menstrual cycle is more than just a period. In fact, your period is just a part of your menstrual cycle. And your menstrual cycle, on a more general perspective, it is a series of physiological and hormonal events that happen regularly in preparation for the possibility of fertilization and pregnancy. So whether or not you want to conceive, you want to have kids, your body is going to be designed for the purpose of reproducing. We have to just, sometimes what we want for ourselves is not really what we're designed to do, but we can definitely work with that. And, we can talk about that later. But again, we're only here to really appreciate the why. And the why is to really carry out the process of carrying out our offspring, right? Reproduction. That's the main thing. So keep this in mind, because this is the driving force behind your cycles, the hormonal events within those cycles, and more specifically, your brain. Your brain throughout your reproductive life is going to be in constant communication with your ovaries and uterus, vice versa, but it's also affecting everything else in your body. But for the purpose of time and for today's lecture, we're just going to focus on the brain, ovaries, and uterus. Okay, but yes, your brain is motivated by that idea, by that objective of carrying out a potential pregnancy for every cycle. So that's it. That's really it. And that being said, your brain, your ovaries, your uterus, they all operate via impressively efficient hormonal feedback systems, right? So there's this, if you think about it, your brain is going to be so far, anatomically speaking, from your ovaries and your uterus. And really, the only way they communicate with each other is through the hormone messaging system, right? So there's always this influx of hormones throughout your life, really, right? It just happens in a, we try to kind of recognize the pattern, and there is, and that's what we're trying to appreciate. But all in all, they work quite effectively just by communicating via hormones. Okay, now, so that's the general concept. Okay, now we're kind of in the next step of this. We want to take a closer look at the individual components of the menstrual cycle, because that'll give us a better idea of how things work, how things progress over the cycle, how things change, and what your experience of it is like. So I may be pretty biased here, but I personally think this is the most fascinating visual aid that ever existed. Not the most perfect one, because the chart assumes that if you look at the x-axis, or the horizontal line, so at the very bottom it says essentially implying that your menstrual cycle only lasts 28 days and your ovulation happens around day 14. So that's a little bit imprecise, or rather it can be misleading to someone who may not know more of the complexity of the menstrual cycle, because not everyone's going to have a 28-day cycle. Not everyone gets to ovulate on the 14th day. Not everyone gets to have like a 3 to 5 day menstruation period. So there's a lot of generalities that, when taken out of context, like, it may mislead a lot of people. But for the most part, this is a great visual tool because, for one, it tells you the different phases that the ovaries go through. So the very beginning, the very top chart there, you'll see the growing follicle, the ovulation bit, corpus luteum, corpus albicans, and then at the bottom it tells you how the uterus changes over your menstrual cycle. So it kind of, that's like a depiction of the thickness and the amount of blood vessels that come on as the cycle progresses. And in between you'll see 3 portions of the chart here. So the second row is your body temperature, because interestingly enough, your core body temperature does change with the influence of progesterone, primarily in the latter half of your cycle. You have the third row there, indicating the anterior pituitary hormones, which are your brain hormones. So you'll see there's fluctuations there as well. And then the ovarian hormones, which are your, the infamous estrogen and progesterone. So you'll see the maybe familiar curves within that cycle. So this is a really handy tool in explaining to people, in showing, or at least reminding yourself that, okay, this is what we can expect to see, maybe feel throughout the ideal healthy menstrual cycle, to say the least. Now, it is a lot to take in, because sometimes it can be, when you're trying to relate this concept to yourself, to your experience of your period, it's very easy to get lost in the pictures. Like, okay, well, my day 1 was like this, why was I feeling like that? Or, right? So I do want to give you a little bit more of an in-depth understanding of what actually goes on. So the next slide here is just to kind of break it down, right? So with the phases of the menstrual cycle, these are your main characters, because for the most part, the menstrual cycles, at least the hormonal changes in the menstrual cycle, they primarily impact the uterus, the ovaries, and the brain, right? But we'll just really focus our time on the changes in the ovaries and uterus. And I say this because your menstrual cycle can be best studied in phases. So you have the ovarian cycle, which comprises of the follicular phase and the luteal phase, and you also have the uterine cycle, which is made up of the menstruation phase, which is your period, your proliferative phase, and your secretory phase. Okay, so there's it's a way to kind of compartmentalize the different hormonal events and their subsequent effects on the ovaries and the uterus. That's really it. But in reality, they're all happening at the same time. There's a lot of overlaps between what happens with the ovaries and the uterus at any given point. And so kind of putting two and two together can make it a bit easier to relate to, but just so you don't get lost in the technical details, this is how we're going to study it. Okay, we're studying it based on what we see change within these organs. Now, again, these cycles, whether it's the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, these are all necessary fluctuations in hormones and necessary changes because we want to facilitate pregnancy, and by doing that, to be able to do just that, we want to be able to promote ovulation. So ovulation, it is the release of the egg from a follicle, right? So you'll see here, I'm actually going to go back to the previous slide here. So you'll see here, maybe I can zoom in. You'll see here that this particular, these follicles, you have this pink circle, and the pink circle with the blue dot here, that's the egg, and it's surrounded by this red layer here, and that's the follicle, right? So ovulation happens when the egg is released from the follicle. So that's it. That is what promotes pregnancy, that is what the menstrual cycle is all about, really, to get to that point where we can release an egg through ovulation, and fun stuff. So it's just going back. Okay, so we gone here. Okay, so I do want to kind of give you again a recap, right, with the brain. The brain's job is to initiate the process of getting your ovaries ready for a possible pregnancy. So your ovaries and your uterus, sorry. And actually, for the first few days of your menstrual cycle, a part of your brain called the anterior pituitary gland, so it sits somewhere in the central portion of the brain, it produces this hormone called follicle stimulating hormone. So it's that pink highlighted thing called FSH, right? From the name itself, your FSH, it stimulates the follicles in your ovaries to grow until the process of ovulation occurs. So you may have heard of the concept of there's only one egg that gets to it only takes one egg to be fertilized and to for it to progress to pregnancy. But we often overlook the fact that there is a race that happens within the ovaries, and it's between a few selected follicles. So there's a few of them that are stimulated by FSH, and so these batch of selected follicles, they are responsive to that brain hormone, and they get stimulated, they grow, and they develop until there is a leader, right? There is a winner, a clear winner, that's called the dominant follicle. I think it's roughly around it's quite significant and substantial in size, but it does become the dominant egg that is chosen to ovulate for that particular month, right? So that's just giving you some context. There's a lot of follicles that are are active and are responsive to FSH. This is important because your follicles actually are the ones producing estrogen. So estrogen, that's why it's called an ovarian hormone. It is a hormone that is produced by your ovaries via the follicles. Okay, so but yes, for the first few days after you get your period, the ovaries are a little bit more quiet, right? So, and the brain picks that up. And once there is that feedback that, okay, nothing's quite happening, I gotta attempt ovulation, right? So there's always this go, go, go kind of mentality from the brain that's, determined to conceive. And so once you have that signal that there's nothing happening within the ovaries, then it starts to initiate that process of ovulation through FSH. And then by that, you have estrogen in the mix. And the nice event that follows that is when estrogen starts to pick up and there is an increasing level of estrogen in circulation. And there is actually another hormone that the brain, the anterior pituitary gland makes. It's called the luteinizing hormone. And it kind of shows up a little later in the first half of your cycle. But it does build up, it does spike. And that together with the estrogen levels being at its peak, these hormonal triggers promote ovulation. Okay? And when ovulation happens, then there is that fertile window. It's opened and there is that large potential for a possible pregnancy. And I guess like a side note here, when you start to track your cycles, when you're aware of using ovulation test kits, this hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, this is what gets tested. Okay, with those P kits, it tests the concentration of LH in your urine, and when you see that positive test, that's typically a predictor of ovulation. So for those who may want to abstain from from sexual intercourse, abstaining from getting pregnant, then this is that perfect opportunity to withhold copulation or sex. And for those looking to conceive, then it opens up this window for conception intercourse. Right, so you make what you will with the information you have, and the ovulation predictor kits are used for these reasons. And I have more information about that. I do have a blog post that I'll maybe link later on, but that's the basis for using that. So far, are you with me? If you have questions about this, maybe take a pause, write down your questions, send it to me later. But otherwise, I will move on to the next slide. Okay, so we're moving on from ovulation to the next phase of the ovarian cycle, which is your luteal phase. So I highlighted here the corpus luteum, as you can see. And there's a little, I don't know if you can really tell from where you are right now, but kind of put there RIP egg. So I put that there because, interestingly enough, after ovulation, what happens to the egg? The egg does get resorbed. Like, it doesn't last very long. The egg is only really alive for 24 to max 48 hours. So if you think about it, you're only really fertile for 1 to 2 days every cycle. Okay, so when the egg gets resorbed, the follicle stays intact. So remember the follicle, that red bag that gets ruptured after ovulation, that actually becomes an organ on its own, and it's actually the only way you make progesterone. So your corpus luteum from follicle to this very important organ that produces progesterone. Okay, and that this only really lasts for 10 to 12, sometimes 14 days. So like the egg, the corpus luteum has a very finite lifespan. So that's why this particular phase in your cycle is fixed, relatively fixed, quite predictably standard. And so this is also a reason why you'll see, once you get into the lab work, once you get to, have the means to confirm ovulation when you're testing for urinary progesterone levels, it only stays elevated for a few days because of the very limited lifespan of the corpus luteum. But hey, it's okay. You make it all over again anyway, right? But once that corpus luteum resorbs, it becomes this white body called corpus albicans. And corpus luteum means yellow body, by the way. So just quite interesting semantics here. But this organ does eventually become it disintegrates eventually, and so you have this lack of progesterone production, right? And guess who picks that up? Or guess who picks up on that message that there's no more progesterone, right? It's the brain. The brain detects that significant dip in progesterone, and once it knows that that's what's happening, then it starts the cycle all over again, wherein it triggers the slowing of endometrial cells in the uterus. It starts your menstrual cycle by commencing menstruation all over again. So this actually brings me to, a really great segue, a really great transition to talking about the uterine cycle, okay? So as you can tell, the uterine cycle, much like your menstrual cycle, it starts with day one. It starts with your first day of your period. So the very first phase of the uterine cycle is your menstruation. And as just as I said, it's triggered by this significant dip in progesterone levels in circulation towards the end of the luteal phase. Okay, so your menstruation is it's triggered by these hormonal changes, and you have this pretty much debris that gets slowed off, it gets cleaned out. It's something that you've built anyway throughout the uterine cycle, so it's not like you're losing out on a whole organ for that matter. So I've had some people kind of ask me that, where do you lose your uterus? Do you lose a significant chunk of it? Does it get sliced off? Well, no, not technically. It is something that does regenerate, so not to worry. But yes, your first few days of your cycle, of the uterine cycle, is when your period comes, and that's roughly around 3 to 5 days, sometimes 7. And I'll tell you more in a bit, but there's usually around 80 to 120 milliliters of menstrual blood loss that happens throughout this phase. Okay, so the next part is the proliferative phase. So what does that mean, right? Now, as I said, when you talk about the menstrual cycle, like, it's all these combination of events, right? So I know we're focusing on the uterus, right? So the proliferative phase of this uterine cycle actually overlaps the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. So remember, in the ovarian phase, there is this significant buildup of estrogen in circulation, right, from the ovaries, as the brain attempts to try to ovulate and stimulate the ovaries to make more hormones. So that hormone, estrogen, in the proliferative phase of the uterus, it actually encourages the proliferation of the uterine cells. So in particular, the topmost layer of the uterus. You can further divide the proliferative phase into early and late, but for the context of this, this 101 class, let's just keep it to proliferative phase. But basically, it starts at the end. This phase starts after your period is done, and it's primarily driven by that steady rise of estrogen. So what estrogen does is, what estrogen does, particularly in the uterus, is that it encourages the production of the uterine cells, hence proliferation. And again, this is all meant to prepare for a possibility of pregnancy. So this is well before ovulation. Okay, so you start to see the uterus start to thicken with estrogen. The next part of the uterine cycle is called the secretory phase. Now, the secretory phase happens towards the latter half of the menstrual cycle, but it actually happens alongside and after ovulation, right? So at this point of the uterine cycle, the uterus actually goes through significant anatomical changes and physiological ones too. So much of this is influenced by progesterone. So remember, the corpus luteum, it makes progesterone. So it enables this the retention of the growth of the uterine lining throughout this cycle, so that it can cozy up the room, right, for a possible fetus to grow. So the presence of progesterone ultimately makes it safe and for a pregnancy to occur in this particular human, but more particularly with progesterone, the endometrium actually slows down that growth phase, but instead of growing, it actually is more vascularized. So what I mean by that is, if you take a look at those squiggly lines within those uterus, within the uterus, that's like my lazy attempt to visualize vascularization. Vascularization means there's more blood supply, there's more blood flow within the thickened lining. So it really helps to, swell it up and thicken. These spiral arteries, do begin to increase in length. They coil more, so there's more surface area for things to grow, for things to have more supply with. The reason why it's called a secretory phase is because the endometrial cells also make these sugar-rich proteins and secretions that enable the nutrition aspect of the pregnancy, right? So it's pretty smart. It's a smart way to carry out the process of reproduction. And the same thing with towards the end of the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, you'll eventually have this dip of progesterone levels, unless of course there is a pregnancy that occurs, right? So then anyway, another hormone takes over with what we call HCG. So that is for pregnancy tests, but there are some mechanisms in place that support the production of more progesterone to sustain a pregnancy. But again, like when there's that dip in progesterone levels towards the end, care of the disintegration of the corpus luteum, then the brain picks that up, right? And so what happens is that, surprise, surprise, menstruation happens again. So take a breather. It's a lot to kind of take in. But I do hope this gives you a little bit more of an overview and, more appreciation of what happens and why we test certain things. Because ultimately, we want to make this a bit more relatable, right? You don't really feel these hormonal changes. Sometimes you do, but for the most part, until you get your period, you don't really feel what's happening in your body. So on a more relatable standpoint, objectively, this is the basis for why we test certain hormones in blood work. We base it on the ratios of the pituitary hormones like the FSH and LH. And sometimes we also put that into context with the hormones that your ovaries produce, like your estrogen and progesterone, right? So, and sometimes this is in line with other blood tests as well. But anyway, we also look at anatomical changes on imaging studies such as ultrasound or laparoscopy, or maybe MRIs. Not usually, but we can utilize technology like this to be able to visualize what's happening, right? And it's not really the most practical way to have I guess like an insightful perspective of the hormonal changes, but we do have subjective experiences of our hormones, really. So there's signs and symptoms that we can look out for, and you may be familiar with already, such as tender breasts, muscle aches, headaches, abdominal cramps, back pain, tiredness, joint pain, acne, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, insomnia. You know the drill, right? So it may or may not come up for you, and I would argue that these are things that can be influenced by hormonal changes as well. They need not be normal, but they can happen. So this may help guide you to understanding what's happening, because, well, your body is designed to respond to hormones and their fluctuations throughout your life. Remember, your body's, your brain, it's very much driven to carry out the process of reproduction. And so everything in your body, everything in your cellular structure is going to be receptive to these very normal and expected hormonal changes. So what is normal? Right? So that's a really good question that I feel not a lot of people really fully grasp, because we're so used to normalizing pathological things like pain, discomfort. You kind of just have to power through things, but in fact, they never have to be normal. So I'll give you some ideas with respect to things like premenstrual symptoms. It's normal to have none or to have some mild, and when I say mild, it's manageable, right? Manageable cramping, tiredness, mood, appetite, and skin changes, right? So things that don't debilitate, right? Same goes for menstrual symptoms. So you may experience none to mild cramping, tiredness, mood, all these changes. So very similar profiles. When it comes to length of the cycle, I kind of gave you a little bit of what I thought about the most fascinating visual aid, because for the most part, it hits a lot of my criteria in terms of great visuals, but it's, again, not accurate when it comes to the average experience of what a normal cycle length looks like. So 25 to 35 days is deemed acceptable in a lot of reproductive societies. So yeah, it kind of sounds very elitist, but yes, they're called societies for that reason. But you may have your normal, right? Like someone might have a 25-day cycle. Someone might have like a 35 or 30 to 35-ish day cycle, right? So it really becomes an issue if it's like, you're going from one moment it's like 25 days, the other it's like 90 days, but then you kind of go back to say 35 days, the other is like 65. So you gotta have that sense of what your average is, and if you're generally falling along the lines of where your average sits, and maybe you're just like a few days late or a few days early, that's okay. But yes, on a general standpoint, 25 to 35 days is great. Flow length is 3 to 7 days. See a lot of people, I talk to a lot of people who have their periods for like a month, which is crazy, and it's been quite disturbingly normalized. So that's not normal. What's normal is if your flow falls into this 3 to 7 day time frame, and maybe to put things into perspective, the heaviness is also something what we would like to assess, right? The first few days are generally the heaviest, and you're generally changing used or soaked menstrual products every 4 to 6 hours, or less than 6 per day. Now, where are we coming up with this number? There is also a little bit of a debate on how much blood loss is normal. And we're looking at around 80 to 120 milliliters of menstrual blood loss. So just because when someone loses more than 120 mils of blood, there is an increased risk for developing anemia. So we like to keep it on the, a little bit further away from that number. And to, I don't expect you to measure how much blood you lose. So using things like tampons, pads, menstrual cup, they can give you a little bit of what the quantity looks like. So a regular pad may hold up to 5 mils of blood. So that's a regular absorbency tampon. Whereas a super absorbent tampon pad, you might hold up to 10 to 15 mils of blood, right? So then you can kind of quantify like, okay, this is excessive, or okay, this is quite normal. Other things that I forgot to put there in the slide is that there's no spotting. There's no, debilitating cramping mid-cycle. So some people would deem it as ovulation pain. So that doesn't really have to be part of your menstrual health. Or your menstrual experience. But these are the main points that I wanted to drive home. On the other hand, what's not normal is, like I said, like anything that interferes with your life or that debilitates you. Pain is a big one. So pain, breast pain, muscle aches, headaches, severe menstrual pain, joint pain, all those things. Exhaustion is also something that is maybe a little bit tricky to discern, because to some degree some tiredness is normal, but if you're constantly crashing and you feel like you can just collapse, that is something else, right? We need to address something else beyond the potential period issue. And so again, like this is like, if you think about this is like kind of working with a spectrum, right? If your symptoms fall along the lines of debility, or it's hitting your confidence quite hard, it's affecting your day-to-day, then we want to be mindful of that, and that is something that warrants investigation and support. So yeah, I've just listed down some other things to kind of note. So other symptoms like extreme bloating, severe diarrhea or constipation, insomnia, and I also forgot to mention here things like premenstrual dysphoric disorder. That's a serious issue as well, right? So that is not normal. And by the way, this is not to shame you, this is meant to educate. Sorry, not that we want to be inclusive here, but I want to make sure you are aware that you never have to suffer. So, which brings me to the next main point of our presentation. I do want to go through some common mistakes people usually make when trying to understand their cycles, or things that may be hurting their menstrual health altogether. So let's kind of summarize this fairly quickly. So relying on your smartphone to predict your cycle. So I love period tracking apps. Maybe love-hate relationship. I have my biases as to what I think is the ideal app. You generally want something that doesn't collect too much data. Anyway, so the problem, but let's focus on the problem. Relying on your smartphone to predict your cycles. The problem here is when you use your period tracker beyond just tracking. So a lot of people forget to, or maybe just don't think about the fact that it's driven by algorithms. Most period trackers, there's a lot of these predictor features, which I would say is a very slippery slope, because it can inaccurately assume what you're going through hormonally or physiologically. More often than not, like it predicts things like ovulation when it really can't. You can't be, this a lot of the times, like period tracking apps collectively assume that everyone has a 28-day cycle, right? So when there's that data set that they're kind of basing information off of, you get misled into thinking that you're also going to ovulate on day 14, or you're also expected to experience the same changes as a million other people on the planet, which is not helping. It's not going to help you in the long run. Now, the other caveat to this with respect to inaccurately tracking is that, at least for a lot of the people that I know struggle with fertility challenges, their activity for conception or even abstinence for people avoiding pregnancy, you can potentially get misled with the timing of your activity. So that, and which might lead to you inadvertently getting the opposite of what you want out of your fertility awareness. So that's a no-no. And then the second part to this, or the main point that I wanted to make with this, is that when we're not, when we're not entirely cognizant of the fertility markers, what to look out for, and all that. So, for example, I have a lot of people who are who get very confused with the concepts of cervical mucus, what quality to note, whether or not it's cervical mucus, or if it's actually a discharge from something that's pathological, like an STD or a yeast infection, right? So then you get this inaccuracies in the data that you're entering. And another common one that I see is for people who maybe assume that day one of your cycle means that you are there's some blood, when in fact it's just light spotting. And day one is really when there is a full flow, right? Whether it's maybe light, but it's not just spotting. It's not just when you wipe, then there's a little bit of blood. That doesn't count. And there's a lot of people who end up looking at day one as this particular event, when in fact, like, they might actually have a cycle flow length that is shorter in nature versus longer. So that's a few instances. Maybe you can relate to, maybe not, but yeah, I do think there is a lot of potential for simply relying on tech to hurt your experience of your menstrual health, at least the awareness part. And the other important thing to keep in mind is activity, right? So I meet a lot of people who are very health conscious, or who are very aware of exercise, and a lot of these people are also very initially misguided about what to do when it comes to incorporating physical activity, because exercising too much, exercising in maybe non-productive ways that can hurt your hormones, or not exercising at all, that's up, and basically kind of having that mismatch between the appropriate level of exercise to the level of stress you're going through, right? Because the intensity, whether it's vigorous or if you're sedentary, the intensity of your physical activity can have a significant effect on your hormone metabolism. So that's another thing to, I'd like for you to reflect on as well. Next one is suboptimal dietary habits. Much like exercise, right? Like if you're eating too much, if you're eating in irregular patterns, or not eating at all, right? When there's this lack of appreciation on the nutritional profile of what you regularly consume, and I say under appreciation when it comes to its impact, again, on hormone metabolism, then there is a good chance that it can hurt the way your hormones are going to interact with each other. Okay. Another lifestyle choice that can really hurt your reproductive health is consumption of alcohol, tobacco, smoking in general, vaping, recreational drugs. These all can place a burden on the body's means of coping with hormonal changes. So keep in mind of your consumption. it's always helpful to kind of become aware of the amount, at the very least, of what you're consuming, because then you have a baseline, right? But we'll go into that later. The other part to this is, if we have poor sleep quality, if we work late night shifts, or there is excessive screen time before bedtime, right? So all of this have something to do with your biological clock or your circadian rhythm. So this has to do with your sleep and wake cycle. A little bit of a side note, your wakefulness cycle is actually powered by your cortisol level, and your cortisol level is also happens to be your stress level, right? Stress hormones. Sorry. Now with the sleep and wakefulness cycle, these can be affected by one, the I guess like the routine that you're going through. So if there's a lot of night shifts that you're taking on, there is a significant effect on the way your brain at least tries to cope with the light, exposure to light and dark, and so that has a direct impact on your melatonin production, your cortisol production, basically affecting your sleep and wakefulness adaptations. And this is also not too far from the concept of sleep quality. When there is disruption with the normal patterns of sleep and wakefulness, then that can significantly affect the quality of sleep that you're getting, right? Sometimes they enable the other way around, but it tends to be a vicious cycle. And then the other part to this is excessive screen time, which is really what we're really worried about here, is the blue light exposure, right? So blue light that comes off of technological devices, these are light rays that mimic the light that we get from direct sunlight, right? So it's while sunlight is great, when we have it too much, especially through technology, it does interfere. It's something that exposes you excessively, right? And so that does, again, affect the sleep and wake cycle too. And consequently, when your hormones in this department are affected, this also interferes with your sex hormone metabolism. So anyway, bottom line is to just acknowledge, like, if this is something that you resonate with, then this might be an avenue to work on when it comes to improving your periods. And then one other major thing is exposure to EDCs. So EDCs stand for endocrine disrupting chemicals, or hormone disrupting chemicals, because they disrupt the hormone metabolism, right? So EDCs, you can there's a lot of them, unfortunately, quite common in our consumption of cleaning products, beauty products, hair care, and paints, plastics, all those things. These are also your preservatives. So they're all over the place. They're synthetically made, and they're called EDCs because they have unique structures that and essentially has the capacity to stimulate or to influence the parts of our bodies that respond to hormones, right? So that's why they're disrupting hormone metabolism. So this is a major thing, right? Like, when we're not acutely aware of the gravity of exposure to these types of chemicals, then we might not have a proper understanding of the burden that our body's going through. So this is hopefully, I don't know if this is news to you, but at least kind of putting this back on your radar. And another major thing that I would say here that's hurting your menstrual health is not knowing what other health conditions you have, or considering unique circumstances you may be in. So for instance, maybe your history of birth control use, whether it's the pill or the injection or the NuvaRing, whatever, right? So this is important to factor in. It's also important to keep in mind your obstetric history. So if you're currently postpartum, then you might have a totally different experience of your periods right now, and maybe you just require a little bit of support there. So this is also an important thing. But I guess like one more notably is that some people who are in the postpartum stage of their life, they may be struggling with periods, quite significantly more than pre-pregnancy, right? So this is another thing. Things like thyroid disease can also impact health conditions. So your thyroid, just a quick overview, it is the small gland behind your neck that pretty much facilitates a lot of very important body functions, including ovulation. So there's that. So when there's some chronic common symptoms like chronic fatigue, weight gain, dry skin or oily skin for that matter, hair loss, nutrient deficiencies, etc. Right? Like I almost always consider thyroid disease as something to address potentially. Kind of on the similar lines with postpartum, if you are in this stage of, when you're in your late 40s, early 50s, usually like late 40s, you may be going through signs and symptoms of perimenopause. So again, this might be a completely different scenario than when you were, a little bit younger, right? So, but it's also important to address this, not just kind of going about putting band-aids on your period issues. If you're one to experience chronic illness, right, then this is also something important to address on top of the period issues. And of course, something that we don't often talk about is the access to resources that support your health. So it almost always boils down to financial limitations, socioeconomic status, these potentially oppressive systems that are that can be in place and may affect your overall experience of care, right? And you're not getting the adequate treatment. So I see a lot of people who have had to have their diagnoses delayed, their care delayed, and that can have a damper on your period health overall. So these are just some of the things to keep in mind. So I know it was a lot of maybe not so smiley things that we talked about. Now we move on to how we can actually enjoy our periods, right? And I'm not going to be all preachy with this because my suggestions are primarily going to be derived from the things that hurt your menstrual cycles, menstrual health overall, right? So ultimately, we want to integrate practices that promote healthy ovulatory cycles, because when we experience things like unpredictable periods, right, most of the time it has something to do with what's causing the brain to prioritize something else rather than reproduction, right? Or when there's a lot of period pain. So we can kind of go back and almost reverse engineer the hormonal perspective in that, what causes period pain in the first place. Is it the presence of inflammatory chemicals? Is it the presence of hormone disrupting chemicals? Is it the not having progesterone, not ovulating at all because of and so we have the lack of progesterone? Is it due to all of these things, and the result is that you have more estrogen? So, when we are able to fully appreciate the hormonal cascades that happen in our menstrual cycle, then we have a better idea of how we can then promote ovulation. So that's where where my head's at, okay, at the very least. Oh, this is blocking. Okay, so as a whole, what I'm trying to do when I'm suggesting these things is my intention is to help you to nourish yourself and your menstrual cycles, hence the slide title, right? So we started with the reliance on smartphone apps for everything to do with fertility tracking or period tracking, but you can be a bit more intentional with how you use your period tracker. So in the sense that we're simply using it to store data because we don't want to treat it like a crystal ball where it's we're relying on it to predict our future because it just won't. It will be a disservice to you. So knowing the normals, which we did walk through, that's going to be a big help in your understanding of your cycles, consequent effect of that is becoming more aware of your other fertility markers like your cervical mucus, basal body temperature, and now that you know this, your hormonal changes will also have an effect on your physical, mental, emotional well-being, right? So you'll see signs and symptoms that if you note them long enough, maybe you'll start to see a pattern, right? And then you become more intuitive in that sense. If you need a helping hand when it comes to becoming more aware of your fertility, your periods for that matter, investing in a fertility awareness method teacher, through their services, of course, can be a great gift for yourself. So that saves you the time. Like I personally had to learn it in that manner because sometimes it's hard to learn by yourself, right? So it's good to have an objective means of assessing the data that you've collected, how it can be relevant to you, and all those things. Another cool, maybe old school way of charting is instead of using period trackers, you can definitely use paper charts. You're basically printing out this. I can share with you a template that I use. Just look out for my email. But you're definitely using paper for that matter. You can just print it as many times as you need. But you're basically using a table format, like a spreadsheet kind of thing, wherein you input your physical symptoms, your temperature if you'd like, and then you draw it out. You connect the dots, and then you start to see that pattern. And a lot of people like this idea because it's very physically engaging too, right? So and it's I hear it's very fulfilling to kind of see the patterns as you progress through your cycle. But yeah, it's a very personal choice, but it is an option. Now, when it comes to exercise, I said, what I said was the intensity of the exercise is something that can affect your hormone metabolism for sure. But what matters is really finding a type of movement that you enjoy and to do it consistently. There is a balance because you also want to be aware of what physiological states you may be in, right? So for someone who might have insulin resistance, you might benefit from a completely different type of exercise, like more weight training compared to someone who is who has who might benefit from more cardio, right? I don't really know a lot of cases where high impact exercises or high cardio activities would fully benefit, but that I digress. Like it can happen. So the key here is consistency and enjoyment, right? So find something that you enjoy and you feel really genuinely energized from, because if you're feeling drained after a workout, that's probably not the one for you, right? You probably would hate it as well. So let that be a gut feeling that you go with. I always, if I don't know you and if I don't know your health history, sometimes my go-to recommendation is to just go for low impact forms of exercises because they're challenging enough and they do provide a therapeutic action in the sense of things like blood sugar control and its consequent effect on hormones. So, things like yoga, things like Pilates, maybe some light weight training, but it's always best to consult with your healthcare provider when it comes to determining what movement is best for you. Next slide. Oh, let me move my thing. Okay. So the next part of this is with the diet, right? So things that you consume on for the most part. Um, it's very easy to hyperfixate on what's trending right now. So, it could be like the TikTok pastas or keto diets or intermittent fasting, all these things. I would say, if you're not working with anyone, and it's maybe tricky to navigate, your best bet is to really opt to have a balanced meal or snack as much as possible. So when I think balanced meal, I'm thinking focusing on the bigger picture, which is focusing on knowing what your macronutrients are. Your macronutrients are your big nutrients, right? Not your vitamins and minerals, but more so your carbohydrates, your fiber, your proteins, your fats. So that's what you want to have an idea of what's more abundant in what. And when you're consuming meals, you want to keep it as dense as possible. That often offers a lot more nutritional therapeutic benefits to fertility, menstrual health, and all that. Especially fiber and protein. Well, fiber for the most part helps with hormone metabolism in many ways, with respect to reducing inflammation, keeping you regular, moving the, reducing the potential hyperstimulation of some hormones that linger in the system. So the therapeutic benefits seem endless. So anyway, packing on the big stuff, the carbs, fiber, and protein, fats, when you have anything to eat, is going to be a big game changer for majority of you who are listening, or for those of you who are experiencing menstrual cycles. Just keep it like that, because you don't really want to overcomplicate your diet, right? It's just the intention of consuming more of the macros that matter. In terms of consumption, not a surprise, I always advocate to avoid alcohol, smoking, recreational drug consumption, because again, these are all big burdens on the organs that are involved in hormone metabolism and consequently your menstrual health. And one of the last few things, addressing your sleep obstacles, limit your screen time. Now, these are not going to happen overnight. Well, quite literally, not quite literally, because you want to know what your personal sleep obstacles are, and finding the right support really matters when it comes to this. I've certainly have had a few people who self-prescribe melatonin and it doesn't work, right? Likely because there's a lot more that you're not addressing versus than just topping it up with melatonin, right? So things like that should make you reflect on what you actually need, so that you're not blindly purchasing things that may or may not benefit you, right? With limiting screen time, it might help to just set a limit. It may help to also find something you look forward to during the day, so you're not as predisposed to just having more time on your phone, time on your on your computer and all that. So being aware of how much time you spend is a great starting point, and then build up your self challenges from there, right? Set a time limit, use that time to go outside, being exposed to sunlight, going outside in nature. These are all things that can really have a wonderful positive impact on your circadian rhythm as well. And then for the EDCs part, or the endocrine disrupting chemicals, you don't have to completely overhaul your pantry or your cleaning product closet, but it may help to slowly look for alternatives to products with harsh chemicals, right? So it helps to understand what you're using certain products for. With things like fragrances, I think that can be a little bit more easily avoided. You can, maybe. Oh, one perspective to this is I had a patient who has who is still well, she had a very hard time letting go of her perfumes. Well, one, because she's had them for a long time, she collects them, but more interestingly is that there is issues with body odor, right? So it was meant to mask that persistent issue that she was going through for a very long time. And so we worked through addressing that essential part of the picture for her health wise. And we did talk about avoiding these fragrances because of its capacity to burden the liver and the hormone metabolism overall. So when we worked on her gut, we worked on her periods, we worked on the the things that was really affecting her confidence, which was body odor. We were actually able to reduce this need to mask things with fragrances, right? And that and I think that's really eye-opening, right? Like maybe assessing the purpose of certain products that that make it to your household. So if there's a way that you can swap that out, great. Then maybe slowly think about alternating that with products that have a better profile overall. Or you could minimize overall use. You could use it maybe once or twice a week, making sure you're off gassing and you're opening up the windows so that you can let more fresh air in. You're promoting circulation within the house. So all those things matter too, right? So there doesn't have to be like a major overhaul all at once. Make it work and understand what the purpose of the products are for. Then you go from there. So it's a little bit easy to transition. And then another thing is with pesticides. I forgot to mention one common source of endocrine disrupting chemicals is pesticides. So we can't really avoid them altogether because they're a majority of the produce. Even organic produce has them. So your best bet is to really wash your produce with some baking soda and maybe vinegar if you like, but baking soda seems to work just fine on its own. There's interesting research behind its ability to dissolve a significant part of the pesticides found in the outer layers of the produce. So, dissolving them in a small tub, a small bowl of water, adding like a teaspoon-ish of baking soda, leaving it for like 12 to 15 minutes, and you're done. Just rinse it off, dry it off, and then store it however means. And that can reduce some of that hormonal burden that can affect your menstrual cycles. And of course, getting the right support to adequately address your needs. So whether it's a nutrition plan, some support with addressing lifestyle obstacles like exercise or alcohol consumption, whether it's a targeted supplementation regimen, right? That's important to address because these are things that when used in the right time and place, they can really work wonders. Some of these things, I'm kind of biased because I provide them, but that doesn't have to be through me. But I find like things like acupuncture can be quite helpful as a treatment, a standalone treatment, or as part of a management plan. When I say appropriate lab testing, this is what I mean is that we test for other things beyond what is routinely tested, right? So a common one that I often recommend testing is fasting insulin levels or your thyroid hormones beyond TSH. So things like that, I think, can give you a broader perspective of what's going on, and that further narrows down the conditions and circumstances that need to be addressed. There's also services like psychotherapy, or just in general seeking care from a trauma-informed provider with respect to boundary setting, or at least having an extra set of ears and eyes to look after you that doesn't seek to judge you, but rather provide you safe spaces to help you process things that are difficult to go through, right? And of course, if you're able to ask for assistance from friends, from colleagues, from community resources, these are all great to have, right? Oh, and some other things that if you're not a patient of mine and you're looking for something to add to your list, these are generally these generally work across the board for a lot of people who are going through different variations of period problems. So I love herbal teas because they're accessible, they're relatively more affordable than more concentrated supplements. They fit really well with a lot of busy lifestyles. It's something that can amplify your busy lifestyle, because I find that when you're drinking a tea, you're kind of forced to stay still and relax and breathe. So it's a nice opportunity to just be. So herbal teas that I love to include in anyone's treatment plan really are ginger root tea, turmeric root, chamomile flowers, fennel seeds, red raspberry leaf, green tea, and so on. You generally want to steep roughly a teaspoon amount of these loose herbs or a tea bag. Steep them for maybe 5 to 10 minutes to get the most benefit when it comes to extracting out the medicinal ingredients, and have 1 to 3 cups a day, right? Or have them all together and enjoy it. TCM concepts, that stands for traditional Chinese medicine concepts. It's a fascinating world on its own. I have the privilege of practicing it as well. Although I'm not a TCM doctor, I do use their concepts quite a bit in my practice. So one easy way to introduce yourself to these concepts is to eat cooked or warmed food. So the concept of this is to not make your digestive system work harder than it should, to kind of warm up the food before you fully digest it. So eating something that's pre-digested-ish can be can take a lot of work off your digestive system's shoulders, essentially. Same concept in adding more warmth, so things like spices to your meal, and beverages, so cinnamon, ginger, paprika, all these things that make it warm and fuzzy all the more. And like I said, getting outside, enjoying your local parks and nature attractions, not only is this quite beneficial for your circadian rhythm, your sleep and wake cycle, but it's also a really hopefully accessible way for you to access that feeling of being more grounded and being able to reconnect with that calmer side of yourself. And there's quite a growing number of compelling evidence that support this. Not that you really need any more reason to get outside, but it's just cool. So that's the depth of the conversation for today. So what we learned today is we became more aware, right? Became more aware of the purpose of the menstrual cycles, how efficient it is, how efficient your body is in general. So we more specifically looked at the brain and how it interacts with your ovaries, your uterus, and the different hormonal and physiological changes that happen with it, right? We also learned about some of the mistakes and the obstacles that can affect or hurt healthy ovulatory cycles. And with that awareness comes with action. So we are hopefully a bit more compelled to use our period tracker apps more intentionally. We're also able to reflect on the types of movements we want to incorporate, have more balanced meals, and have more time in nature more regularly. If this concept is new to you, now we also know about avoiding environmental hormonal burdens. So with endocrine disrupting chemicals and fragrances, household cleaning products, skin beauty care products, pesticides, all those things. And we also learn to use nature's tools. So teas, TCM concepts like warmed foods and getting outside. These are all accessible ways for you to have some extra hormonal support. And of course, more importantly, getting the right support. So I just threw some ideas that you can consider if you want to have a bigger circle that provides more care for you, right? if you're ever curious, I do have, you know, I would be more than happy to provide the support that you may need. There's a few ways we can work together as well. So I do want to introduce you to my upcoming course this spring 2023. It's called Fertility at Your Fingertips, where I talk about mainly cervical mucus, but it's also applying concepts of, this is like an extension essentially of what we're learning today, and how it can be something more practical for you to use, not just for fertility awareness, but also going forward as you get older. This is an empowering tool that, just need a little bit of learning, but it will be available soon. I can also support you one-on-one. So especially if you're in Ontario, we can definitely take advantage of naturopathic visits, where I will be providing well-rounded, care plan for you, considering your unique circumstances and obstacles to fertility and reproductive health. And on a broader scale, if you're interested in having me support your community through community outreach programs, contributing to publications, blog articles, research initiatives, workshops, all those things, just send me a message. I'm happy to do so. It's something that I've done in the past and that I continue to include in my practice, because I always find it fulfilling to be able to provide more information on a broader scale. So let me know. I'm super excited to be potentially working with you. But until then, I hope I hope you found this session useful. So I do really want to thank you for your patience, especially in the beginning with all of the technical issues. I really appreciate your time. I actually did have questions from a few registrants that I had sign up for this lecture today. Just 3. And they're not here, so hopefully you know who you are. you can just skip to this portion so that you can have your answers from me. So the question was about this is from a fertility concept. Okay, so there is a question about things like abortion or elective abortions causing infertility issues. So the short answer to that is no, it does not. So there was there's a lot of worry, and it's not just this person that specifically asked me, but I also hear it from many other people too, that there is a concern that having, implementing this choice that you make about terminating pregnancy and how it can affect future fertility. And it's hopefully this reassures you that this will not have a permanent impact on your future fertility. So I would say it's more of what would be important right now if your focus is to, just recover and maybe think about this goal of having kids in the future. Right now, your focus is you should be focusing on getting the support you need to be able to process any lingering emotions, difficult thoughts that maybe disrupt your day-to-day. Physical support as well is very important. Because when it's done safely, there's less of a risk for future fertility. The issue becomes when it's it's not done with supervision, right? Then there's a lot of unknowns whether the tissue's been cleared out. So it is something that you do want to have an extra set of eyes for because you want that extra care to make sure that it doesn't, that possibility does not impact your future fertility. Overall, on its own, it's not really going to make you face fertility issues in the future. The next question that someone asked me is about postpartum. So postpartum fertility awareness. So this particular person wants to avoid getting pregnant at least in the next 2 years after she gave birth, and how to go about doing that. So it's never too early to start charting. I'll bet, with the early stages of postpartum, you probably won't get a period, but it's also not unheard of to hear people get their period back around 6 weeks after, right? So, which is, not usual, but you can definitely start tracking if you have the means. Energy is what I mean, really. You can, it also makes a difference when you are breastfeeding, because that hormonal feedback system that is involved in lactation, that actually does interfere with ovulation, right? So evolutionarily speaking, it's protective because it's preventing you to expend more energy than you have to, right? It's safe, helping you preserve that. But in some cases, it happens, right? Like while you're breastfeeding, you could still ovulate in between. So I think what the answer boils down to really, first understanding your circumstance. Like, I would want to know, like, if you're breastfeeding, are you experiencing, lactation issues? Like, how frequently are you doing that? Is there also the need to consider, if we're using supplement formula milk on top of breastfeeding, right? Because that may interfere with the pattern of prolactin, or that production of the hormones involved in lactation. And it's also to do with your the underlying health conditions that you may or may not have, right? Like I would want to know more about your history of thyroid disease, the possibility of having it right now, your overall state of dehydration, are you eating well? So all those things, all those things do matter when it comes to addressing roadblocks to ovulation, because ultimately, if you want to be able to have a sense of when to avoid sexual intercourse, to avoid pregnancy, it's important to be aware of where you are in your cycle, regardless of whether or not you've had your period back. But on top of that, knowing what your unique circumstances are can give you a better sense of what to avoid. Especially if there's if say you're suspecting that you're in your fertile window, you're experiencing that buildup of cervical mucus, then maybe it's good to have other things in place, contraceptive methods in place to really prevent that. But yeah, I think my first few steps would be to just chart if you can, or at the very least, take note of your bodily changes, so through cervical mucus, and being aware of your scenario, your circumstances. So breastfeeding situation, whether you're using top-up supplement formula, whether you're going through other health conditions like thyroid disease, so on and so forth. So hopefully that answers your question. And then the last question I had was about PCOS. So the question, I believe, is with if tracking your periods, or I think the general concern was getting a sense of control with the irregular nature of this person's cycles because of PCOS. So I'll actually do another lecture on PCOS on its own, but as a quick answer to this is that it has everything to do with PCOS, because a PCOS stands for polycystic ovarian syndrome. It is essentially an ovulatory issue wherein most of the time people have problems ovulating regularly or ovulating at all. So kind of going back to the concept of the progesterone production, which only happens when you ovulate. So when there's issues with ovulation altogether, there's that lack of exposure to progesterone, right? And progesterone has so much influence on hormones, our experience of menstrual cycles, and that includes predictability of your menstrual cycles, heaviness of your menstrual flow. It can also influence, the sometimes skin, hair, nail changes, right? So, this is kind of like a way to simplify it, but there's effects between, the ratios of estrogen and progesterone in circulation and the presence of testosterone. And with another layer to PCOS is that there is that spectrum of high androgen levels or testosterone levels, which then impact physical symptoms, metabolic symptoms, and all that. So, with respect to answering your question, knowing your cycle, being aware of your cycle, being aware of how to chart your symptoms, whatever your experience is, it's even going to make you more informed about where you're currently at during your cycle, regardless of whether or not you've had your period, right? Because it's always good to start somewhere to have a baseline. Then you build up on that data, right? Like you accumulate as much data as you can, then you have a better sense. And another thing that I don't think I mentioned was when, if people start missing their periods, that's an imprecise way to describe what's happening in the menstrual cycle, right? So if you're missing your periods, you technically have your ovulation delayed, right? And you have a long follicular phase. Then you have your periods, because then you have a more predictable latter phase. So anyway, so understanding, if you have PCOS, understanding what your personal roadblocks are is going to make a big difference, because then that will determine what direction to take when you're addressing your issues. But at the same time, even starting with just being intentional about tracking, that can make a world of difference in your appreciation of your menstrual health. So that's it for my questions. I don't think anyone really left any questions on the live chat, which is fine. But I do, for those of you who are here, who stuck through this, you're still here towards the end, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for this is my very first time kind of running this by myself. So thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I will send the replay of this video, and I will make sure to put timestamps so that you can just skip right ahead to where you want to focus your attention on. And I hope to see you in the next video. I hope you have